In all my years on this bench, and we're talking over 40 years here, you think you've seen everything. Police officers, they come before me all the time. Good people, most of them. They serve our community. They protect us. They deserve our respect. But that Tuesday morning in November, something walked into my courtroom that made my blood run cold. From the moment Chief Robert Mancuso entered, I could feel a tension in the air, like a storm waiting to break. 6'2", silver hair gleaming under the courtroom lights, his uniform immaculate, every button polished, every crease sharp. He walked like he owned the place, a smirk on his face that dared anyone to challenge him. But this wasn't just arrogance. It was the kind of power that had been quietly corrupting this city for years. Mancuso had built a fortress of influence. Everyone in Providence respected or feared him. For 25 years, he had navigated politics, alliances, and favors, always staying just on the edge of trouble. But what most people didn't know, not yet, was that the FBI had been watching him, building a case slowly, carefully, waiting for the right moment. And that moment was now. I remember arriving at court early that morning, like always. 8:20, coffee in hand, reviewing the day's docket with the calm, focused 40 years of experience brings. When I saw his name, Chief Robert Mancuso, contempt of court, my stomach sank. This wasn't just another officer being reprimanded. This was a test, and one that would push everything I'd learned about law, authority, and courage. Months earlier, a routine case involving Officer Tommy Rodriguez had raised red flags. Rodriguez, a young officer with 5 years on the force, had been accused of excessive force during a traffic stop. At first glance, the evidence seemed straightforward. Video footage, witness statements, everything pointed to one conclusion. But then things started to disappear. Reports vanished, dashcam footage went missing, witnesses changed their stories. Slowly, carefully, the case was being sabotaged. It became clear someone high up was manipulating the process. Someone with power. Someone like Chief Mancuso. He had the reach to alter evidence, intimidate witnesses, and influence careers. This wasn't just about law enforcement anymore. It was about a man who had decided he was above the law itself. By the time he arrived in my courtroom that morning, the room was unusually full. Lawyers I didn't recognize, men in suits, and agents quietly observing. Among them, Agent Sarah Collins from the FBI, a silent presence, her eyes sharp, noting every move. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, and everyone knew, even if they didn't fully understand, that something historic was about to happen. Mancuso walked in precisely at 9:30. His posture screamed authority, his eyes scanning the room as if everyone was there to witness his greatness. He didn't acknowledge me. He didn't nod or bow. He simply assumed control of the space. And for a moment, it felt like the room had tilted in his favor. But I had seen that before. I had faced bullies, liars, and men drunk on power. This was no different. Chief Mancuso, I said firmly, breaking the silence. You failed to appear for your court-ordered testimony last week. Do you have an explanation? He looked me straight in the eyes, smirk intact, and said words that still echo in my mind. Judge, with all due respect, I had more important things to do. I run a police department. Real criminals to catch, not sit here answering questions about paperwork. The arrogance, the complete lack of accountability. It was staggering. Here was a man who had taken an oath to uphold the law, flaunting it openly, daring anyone to stop him. I could feel the blood pressure rising, not just mine, but the collective heartbeat of everyone in that courtroom. Lawyers murmured among themselves, the agents shifted slightly, and even the spectators leaned forward, sensing the confrontation building. This wasn't routine. This was a reckoning. Mancuso, in his mind, had decades of untouchable influence. But here in my courtroom, his power was about to be measured against something far older and stronger. The rule of law. He stepped closer to the bench, bold, threatening, unafraid. Judge Caprio, he said, you need to understand. I've protected this city for 25 years. I know the mayor, the governor, business leaders. They all rely on me. I remain calm, steady. 40 years on the bench had taught me to control emotions, even when the other person tried to provoke fear. Chief, I replied, in this courtroom, the only relationship that matters is your relationship with the truth. Do you understand why you're here? Instead of answering, he scanned the room again, arrogance dripping from every gesture, then faced me with pure contempt. Judge, I run this town. Not you, not the mayor, not the council. I decide what happens on these streets. I decide what evidence matters and what doesn't. And you're putting me in a difficult position. The room was silent. You could hear a pin drop. Everyone present realized this was no ordinary confrontation. Here was a man who was sworn to protect the law, openly defying it. And I knew, deep down, that the stakes were higher than any personal threat. This was about setting the standard. In my courtroom, the law is supreme, and no one is above it. Every eye in the courtroom followed him, anticipating his next move. He straightened, hands behind his back, exuding a confidence that was almost terrifying. But I could see the cracks beneath that surface. Even the most powerful people have weaknesses, and today I was determined to expose them. Agent Collins shifted in her seat, her presence a quiet reassurance. The FBI had been patient. They had spent months gathering evidence, documenting every misstep, tracking every act of intimidation. Today, their work would be visible to everyone. Today, the law would prove stronger than any badge or title. Mancuso raised his voice, almost shouting now, trying to intimidate. You think you can judge me, Judge Caprio? Do you understand who I am? I met his gaze steadily, my voice calm, cutting through the tension like steel. I understand exactly who you are, Chief. But this courtroom isn't about who you are. It's about what you've done and whether you've broken the law. That is all that matters. For a moment, it seemed he might storm out, to resist, to flee, to challenge. But he didn't. He realized, even in his arrogance, that leaving now would be an admission of guilt. And so he stood, defiant, daring, but trapped within the rules he had sworn to uphold. The energy in the room was electric. People leaned forward, whispering, holding their breath. Even those who had known Mancuso for decades couldn't believe the spectacle. This was history unfolding live. The law confronting raw, unbridled power, and the world watching. I knew the coming hours would be tense. Witnesses would speak. Evidence would be presented. The full story of corruption, manipulation, and fear would finally see daylight. But in that moment, in the stillness after his defiance, I realized something powerful. No one, no matter how mighty, can stand against the truth forever. And so, with a steady hand and a determined gaze, I called the court to order. The trial of a lifetime had begun. And in my courtroom, for the first time in decades, a man who thought he ran the town was about to face the law in its purest, most unstoppable form. The courtroom was buzzing, though you could barely hear sound. Everyone there, lawyers, reporters, even the students, felt the tension like a physical weight. People leaned forward in their seats, straining to catch every word, every gesture. And Chief Mancuso, he was trying to mask it, but I could see the twitch in his jaw, the tightening of his hands. Even the most arrogant people have cracks, and today, his were beginning to show. When someone has been in power for decades, like Mancuso, they grow confident, almost untouchable. They believe rules don't apply to them, that their influence is enough to bend reality. And for years, that belief had been true for him. The city's systems, the politicians, even other officers, they all quietly obeyed or looked the other way. But in my courtroom, the rules were clear, and the law is blind to rank, badge, or wealth. It all started quietly months before that day. Officer Rodriguez's case was the first sign, the warning bell that something was wrong. The evidence disappearing, the witnesses intimidated, the files altered. It wasn't random. It was systematic. Every time someone tried to do the right thing, Mancuso's influence reached in, bending the truth, covering tracks. And it wasn't just one case. This pattern had been happening for years, quietly poisoning the city. The FBI had been monitoring him for 2 long years, carefully documenting each act. Corruption, bribery, witness tampering, obstruction of justice. They had it all. But they had waited. Patience was their weapon. They knew that one misstep in public, one moment of arrogance, would expose everything. And Mancuso, blinded by his own power, gave him exactly that moment in my courtroom. As I looked across the room, I noticed Agent Collins again. She had been watching quietly, her expression calm but alert. That's how professionals operate. They wait, they observe, they let the subject reveal themselves. And reveal himself he did. Every threat, every arrogant word, every attempt to intimidate, that was proof. And the beauty of it was, the whole courtroom was witness to it. Every citizen present, every clerk, every student, every reporter, they all saw justice in action. I could feel the energy of the room, a mixture of fear, anger, and fascination. For most people, this was a rare glimpse behind the curtain of power. They were seeing a man who thought himself untouchable crumble, if only slightly, under the weight of accountability. Even the seasoned lawyers were tense. They understood the significance. This was history being made, a story that would be remembered in the city for decades. When Mancuso tried to use his connections, name-dropping mayors, governors, and business leaders, it became clear how dangerous arrogance can be. For years, he had assumed power over everyone. He had thought that his badge made him immune, that his network gave him invincibility. But the law has no favorites. No matter who you know, no matter what files you keep, justice has a way of leveling the playing field. The threats he made against my family, specifically my son Michael, crossed the line. That was personal, and in that moment, I felt something I rarely feel in the courtroom: pure, focused anger. Not reckless, but righteous. Anger that demanded action. Threatening a family to avoid accountability is the behavior of someone who believes rules don't apply to them. That is precisely why the law exists, to stop people like him. Agent Collins didn't hesitate. She and her team moved with precision, professionalism, and authority. Within moments, Mancuso was surrounded, his world of perceived control collapsing. The handcuffs clicked. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as the man who declared he ran the town was restrained. It was poetic justice. Every word he had spoken, every action had been recorded. Every threat was evidence. Every smirk now replaced with the stark reality of consequence. The reactions in the courtroom were powerful. Some were shocked, some relieved, some vindicated. Officer Santos, who had silently suffered under Mancuso's reign, felt validation. Detective Torres felt the weight lifted. Citizens and students saw that integrity and courage can still prevail, even against those who think they are untouchable. This moment was more than an arrest. It was a statement. A statement that law and justice are stronger than arrogance and corruption. But what struck me most was how the arrest didn't immediately solve all problems. The ripple effects were enormous. Cases that had been manipulated or buried started surfacing. Officers who had felt silenced found the courage to speak up. The culture of fear began to shift, slowly but surely. Justice, though delayed, was finally asserting itself. Over the next few weeks, the city felt a sense of cautious optimism. New leadership in the police department implemented reforms that had been long overdue. Body cameras, transparency measures, civilian oversight boards, changes that would have been impossible under Mancuso's control, became reality. Slowly, integrity returned. Officers could finally do their jobs without fear of retaliation. And the community could start trusting the badge again, knowing that accountability mattered. Through it all, the media amplified the story. Headlines shouted the arrest, national coverage broadcasted the spectacle, and citizens everywhere were reminded that no one is above the law. This wasn't about vengeance. It was about principle. Accountability is the foundation of trust, and trust is essential for any society to function. The impact on Officer Rodriguez and his family was profound. What had seemed like a hopeless situation was finally resolved. Exoneration, justice, and a restored sense of dignity were theirs. Officer Santos' words echoed the sentiment of countless others. The badge represents integrity, honor, and responsibility, and seeing those values defended renewed faith in the system. Looking back, What stands out most about this case is not the drama or the headlines. It's the lesson it taught about power, accountability, and courage. People in positions of authority may abuse their power, but the system, when it works as intended, has mechanisms to correct that abuse. More importantly, ordinary citizens and honest officials, when they have the courage to act, can make that system function effectively. Even months later, I would reflect on the lessons learned that day. It wasn't just about Mancuso. It was about the subtle ways corruption can grow, the quiet fear that prevents good people from speaking out, and the extraordinary impact that integrity, courage, and lawfulness can have. One man's arrogance exposed an entire network of wrongdoing, but it also inspired others to act with honor and vigilance. Justice, after all, isn't just a single verdict or an arrest. It's a living principle that requires constant attention. It thrives when people recognize their responsibilities and take action, no matter how intimidating challenge. The courtroom, in that moment, was more than a room. It was a symbol of what is possible when law is applied fairly, firmly, and without fear. And while the arrest of a powerful figure can make headlines, the true victory lies in the restoration of trust, the empowerment of good officers, and the demonstration that accountability is real. Citizens saw that courage matters. Officers saw that honor still has value. And society was reminded that democracy only functions when no one is above the law. Even after Mancuso's arrest, the tension in the city didn't completely vanish. Change, no matter how urgently needed, is rarely immediate. The officers, the citizens, even politicians, all were adjusting to a new reality. For decades, they had been under the shadow of a man who thought he was untouchable. Now suddenly the rules had changed. Courage and truth had won a major battle, but the war against corruption was only beginning. The first few days after the trial were surreal. The courtroom was still fresh in everyone's minds. The memory of that Tuesday morning imprinted in their minds. People spoke of it in hushed tones, as if recounting a story they couldn't believe had actually happened. He said he ran the town, one officer whispered, and now he's behind bars. Even those who had felt powerless felt a new sense of hope. If Mancuso could be held accountable, perhaps they could finally see justice in other areas as well. The investigation didn't stop with the arrest. Agent Collins and her team continued to uncover layers of corruption that had been hidden for years. Reports, emails, covert meetings, everything was examined meticulously. What became clear was that Mancuso had been a single figurehead of a much larger system of control. Other officers, politicians, and business people had been complicit, whether out of fear, greed, or loyalty. It was a web that reached far beyond what anyone had imagined. Court proceedings began in earnest. Witnesses who had once been too afraid to speak were now stepping forward. They recounted stories of threats, intimidation, and manipulation. Some had faced retaliation for minor complaints. Others had lost promotions or been reassigned. The bravery required to come forward was immense. And as their voices filled the courtroom, the full scale of the corruption became undeniable. The media coverage intensified. International outlets picked up the story, highlighting the arrest of a high-ranking police chief and the revelations about systemic corruption. Citizens from abroad followed the trial closely, sharing stories online, debating the implications, and marveling at the courage it took to bring a powerful man to justice. The story went viral, not because of drama alone, but because it represented a universal principle: accountability matters. Power alone cannot protect wrongdoing. Within the police department, reforms were implemented quickly, though not without resistance. Body cameras became mandatory, evidence handling procedures were strengthened, and officers were educated about ethics and accountability. Some officers struggled with the changes. They had grown accustomed to the old ways, but gradually a culture of transparency and integrity began to take hold. The message was clear: protecting the law was no longer optional. I recall one afternoon during a follow-up hearing. Officer Rodriguez, who had suffered under Mancuso's corrupt influence, spoke openly about his experiences. His words were simple but powerful. I wanted to do my job honestly. I wanted to protect the people. But fear stopped me. Now, I can finally act without worrying about what the chief might do next. His honesty brought tears to some in the courtroom. It was a reminder that the consequences of corruption stretch far beyond a single individual. It affects careers, families, and the trust of the entire community. Meanwhile, Mancuso's lawyers tried every tactic to minimize his responsibility. They argued technicalities, challenged witness credibility, and attempted to paint him as a scapegoat. But the evidence was overwhelming. Every threat, every manipulation, every act of corruption had been meticulously documented. For the first time, the scales of justice were balanced, and the truth was undeniable. Public reaction was strong. Citizens rallied behind the officers willing to speak out. Social media amplified their voices, sparking discussions about the importance of transparency, integrity, and ethics. Online campaigns highlighted the need for systemic change, ensuring that similar abuses of power could not happen again. Schools, universities, and civic organizations used the case as an example, teaching lessons about accountability and civic responsibility. Despite the intensity of the proceedings, there were moments of personal reflection. I often thought about the lessons this case would leave behind. Power, when unchecked, is dangerous. Arrogance can blind even the most experienced leaders. But courage, honesty, and steadfast commitment to principles can overcome even the most entrenched corruption. Every individual who had spoken truth to power had made a difference. Every observer had witnessed the strength of accountability in action. The courtroom became a classroom for the city. People learned firsthand that the law is not merely words on a page, but a living system designed to protect society. It is a mechanism that ensures fairness, justice, and accountability, even when the stakes are high and the opponent is powerful. Mancuso's downfall was a vivid example. Influence and connections cannot override ethics. They can delay justice, yes, but not stop it. One particularly emotional day involved testimony from an officer who had quietly endured years of manipulation. She described the fear that had shaped her career, the moral conflicts she faced daily, and the sense of isolation she felt. Her voice trembled, yet she held her ground. It was a poignant reminder that the fight against corruption is often quiet, personal, and deeply human. Those who step forward, even at great personal risk, are the true heroes of such stories. The ripple effects of the trial extended beyond the courtroom. Policymakers began discussions about stronger oversight, citizen review boards, and ethical training for law enforcement. Community organizations held forums to educate citizens about their rights and responsibilities. Schools incorporated modules on law and civic duty. The story, while rooted in a single city, inspired change far beyond its borders. People realized that systemic change is possible when ordinary citizens and dedicated officials refuse to accept wrongdoing. Throughout it all, Mancuso remained defiant at times, attempting to maintain control over his image. But no smirk, no threat, no attempt at influence could erase the facts. Each piece of evidence, each testimony, reinforced a simple truth: no individual is above the law. That principle resonated with people everywhere, especially abroad, where the story went viral across news outlets, blogs, and social media platforms. Millions watched, millions shared, and millions were inspired. For the officers who had once felt trapped, there was a new sense of empowerment. They could now act with integrity without fear of retaliation. The public, too, saw that justice was achievable. This was not just a legal victory, it was a moral victory. It proved that courage and truth could prevail even in the face of long-standing corruption. And as the weeks passed, the transformation became more visible. Honest leadership replaced fear-driven management. Transparency became standard. Community trust, once fractured, began to heal. The arrest and prosecution of a corrupt police chief became more than a news story. It became a blueprint for reform, an example of the power of law, and a testament to the strength of those who dare to stand up for justice. Even after the dust had settled from Chief Mancuso's dramatic arrest, the city was still feeling the aftershocks. The courthouse had been the stage for an unprecedented confrontation, and the story traveled far beyond Providence. Citizens, officers, journalists, and even students shared the events across social media, spreading a message that resonated universally. Accountability matters. Power without responsibility is dangerous, and no one is above the law. Inside the police department, change was becoming tangible, though it wasn't easy. The interim chief, Captain Williams, faced enormous challenges. Implementing reforms in a department long governed by fear and influence meant upsetting routines and breaking old loyalties. Body cameras were introduced for every officer, civilian oversight committees were created, and a culture of transparency was encouraged. These measures were not symbolic. They were practical tools designed to restore trust. Officers who had previously felt trapped or silenced began to find their voice. Maria Santos, a young officer who had bravely shared her fears in court, became a symbol of integrity. She explained to colleagues that accountability did not mean betrayal. It meant honesty, respect for the law, and protection for citizens. Slowly, the department's culture started to shift from fear-driven compliance to principled action. The community noticed the difference immediately. Citizens who had grown cynical about law enforcement began seeing a new approach in action. Complaints were now handled with care and transparency. Investigations were no longer covered up or manipulated. The city slowly regained faith that the police could be trusted once again. And as the word spread, the story of Chief Mancuso's arrest became more than a headline. It became a lesson in civic responsibility and the importance of oversight. I remember receiving countless letters from residents and officers. Some were heartfelt thanks, expressing relief that the city was finally reclaiming justice. Others shared stories of fear, frustration, and hope. One letter from Officer Rodriguez's wife, Carmen, reminded me why this case mattered so much. Judge Caprio, because of what you did, my husband's case was finally resolved fairly. He was exonerated completely. Our family will never forget your courage. But even beyond individual stories, the larger implications were clear. Businesses and community leaders, once intimidated by Mancuso's threats and connections, now felt they could operate openly and honestly. Integrity was no longer a risk, it was a requirement. Policies that had been long ignored or circumvented were finally enforced, demonstrating that systemic change is possible when leaders act decisively. Throughout these weeks, I reflected often on what had brought this moment about. It wasn't just the arrest itself. It was the careful planning, patience, and dedication of those who had worked behind the scenes. Agent Collins and her FBI team had been extraordinary. They had observed, documented, and waited for Mancuso to reveal himself fully. Only when he exposed his arrogance, threats, and corruption in the courtroom could justice be applied effectively. Their strategy demonstrated that patience, evidence, and courage are the most powerful tools against abuse of power. The courtroom itself remained a symbol. It had been the place where law overcame fear, where principle prevailed over intimidation. For every person who witnessed the events, whether in person or through news coverage, it became a lesson in justice. Judges, lawyers, and students alike saw firsthand how a single stand against corruption could ripple outward, transforming an entire community. Even 6 months later, the city was feeling the benefits of the reforms. Officers were proud to wear their badges again, knowing their actions were supported by ethical leadership. Community policing initiatives flourished, and citizens felt safer engaging with law enforcement. The narrative had shifted from fear and silence to courage and transparency. And the lessons from that one courtroom moment continued to shape decisions across the city. Yet the story was more than just policy and reform. It was deeply human. The courage of individuals like Officer Santos and Detective Torres reminded everyone that systemic change begins with personal bravery. Those who speak truth to power inspire others, creating a culture where integrity becomes the norm rather than the exception. Their voices, once silenced by intimidation, now carried authority and weight. Mancuso's downfall also highlighted the importance of accountability at the highest levels. For decades, he believed that influence, connections, and fear could protect him. Yet the law, when applied consistently and fairly, revealed the limits of such power. His threats, files, and arrogance could not shield him from the consequences of his actions. And in witnessing his arrest and prosecution, citizens everywhere were reminded that justice can reach even the most seemingly untouchable figures. The media played a crucial role in spreading this message. International coverage, viral videos, and news articles shared the story widely. Millions of people around the world witnessed how a system of law, guided by integrity and courage, overcame corruption. It wasn't just a local victory. It became a global example of the power of justice. Keywords like corrupt police chief, courtroom arrest, FBI investigation, and justice restored circulated widely, capturing attention and inspiring dialogue. Throughout all this, the emotional impact was undeniable. Officers who had lived in fear felt a renewed sense of purpose. Citizens who had lost faith in institutions saw a tangible example of accountability. And the courtroom, that sacred space, reminded everyone that laws are not mere guidelines. They're the foundation of trust, fairness, and democracy. I also thought often about what my father taught me. Frank, power without humility is corruption waiting to happen. Chief Mancuso had all the power, yet no humility. That combination, I realized, is the most dangerous of all. It blinds people to their mistakes, encourages abuse, and isolates them from reality. But when confronted by truth, courage, and law, even the most arrogant figure is forced to reckon with consequences. Letters, messages, and public feedback continue to pour in. Teachers use the story in classrooms, emphasizing ethics and civic responsibility. Students debated the case in law schools and universities. Social media users shared the narrative widely, emphasizing lessons about integrity, accountability, and personal courage. The arrest of one man had created a wave of awareness and action that extended far beyond the courthouse walls. The practical changes in the police department became more visible daily. Promotions were now merit-based, misconduct investigations were fair and transparent, and officers were encouraged to report wrongdoing without fear. The community began to see real results, reduced corruption, more honest policing, and a renewed commitment to protecting citizens rather than serving personal agendas. And yet, the story wasn't finished. While Mancuso had been removed from power, the culture he had fostered needed ongoing attention. Leaders, officers, and citizens all recognized that vigilance is required to prevent corruption from taking root again. The events of that courtroom morning became a lesson not only in accountability, but in the necessity of maintaining integrity over time. It was a story that combined drama, emotion, and moral clarity. It showed that the human element, courage, honesty, and resilience, is as crucial to justice as laws themselves. Citizens, officers, and leaders alike learned that standing up to wrongdoing is not just about confrontation. It's about protecting the principles that allow a society to function fairly and safely. Even now, when I reflect on that day, I see the faces of Officer Santos, Detective Torres, and all the witnesses who spoke truth. I hear the voices of concerned citizens, the reporters capturing every word, and the students witnessing history. Their courage, attention, and hope created a chain reaction that ensured the law triumphed. In short, Section 4 shows that true justice is not instantaneous. It is a process. It requires bravery, persistence, and systemic attention. It impacts individuals, institutions, and entire communities. And it demonstrates a simple but profound truth. Accountability and integrity are the foundation of trust, both in law enforcement and in society. By the time the final hearings began, the city had been transformed by the shockwaves of Chief Mancuso's arrest. Citizens, officers, and leaders all understood the gravity of what had happened. Justice was no longer a distant concept. It had been demonstrated clearly, publicly, and powerfully. Yet, While the arrest and investigations were crucial, the true victory was not just in punishing one man, but in restoring faith, integrity, and accountability throughout the system. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Every eye was fixed on Mancuso as he faced the culmination of his actions. He had tried to intimidate witnesses, manipulate evidence, and assert dominance for decades. But here, in this room, all of that power meant nothing. The law, impartial and unyielding, held him accountable. Witness after witness came forward, courageously recounting stories that had been silenced for years. Officers described threats, intimidation, and fear that had governed their decisions. Citizens spoke of the anxiety and mistrust that had grown under his influence. And as each story unfolded, the scale of his corruption became undeniable. Even the most sympathetic observers could no longer excuse or ignore his actions. The courtroom was a crucible of truth. The tension was palpable, but so was the sense of justice being realized. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, every small detail reinforced the simple, universal truth: no one is above the law. And that truth resonated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Social media, international news, and online discussions spread the story to millions. People everywhere saw that courage and honesty could triumph over corruption, and that accountability is not optional, it is essential. Agent Collins and her team had orchestrated a meticulous investigation, and their work paid off spectacularly. Every act of manipulation, every threat, every falsified report had been documented. The evidence was airtight. Mancuso's defense crumbled under the weight of truth. His arrogance, which had once made him seem untouchable, now highlighted his downfall. In his own courtroom, he had revealed the very proof that sealed his fate. The impact on the police department was profound. Leadership embraced a culture of transparency and integrity. Officers who had been hesitant to speak out felt empowered to do so. Procedures for reporting misconduct became standard, not optional, and the community began to see law enforcement in a new light: trustworthy, accountable, and committed to justice rather than personal gain. I remember the moment the final verdict was read. Silence hung in the room like a heavy curtain, broken only by the words of the judge confirming accountability. For some, there were tears of relief. For others, nods of approval. And for the community, it was a symbol, a living example of the power of law, integrity, and courage. This moment proved that change is possible, even against entrenched corruption. The story of Officer Rodriguez and other honest officers became a testament to resilience and moral courage. They had endured years of intimidation and uncertainty, yet they persisted. Their perseverance was a lesson that integrity cannot be crushed by threats, influence, or fear. And as they stepped forward, supported by evidence and witnesses, they inspired countless others to stand up for truth and justice. Beyond the courtroom, the city was evolving. Policies were reformed, oversight mechanisms strengthened, and transparency became a core principle of leadership. The community observed these changes, their trust rebuilding with each responsible decision. Young people, watching the events unfold, learned an invaluable lesson. Justice requires courage, accountability, and the willingness to speak truth to power. Mancuso's downfall also demonstrated a universal lesson for audiences abroad. Unchecked power is dangerous, but patience, courage, and lawfulness prevail. Across the globe, millions saw that accountability matters, that corruption can be confronted, and that integrity is a force stronger than fear or influence. The story became a symbol of hope, a case study of how society can reclaim justice when ordinary citizens and professionals act courageously. Even after the legal process concluded, the emotional impact continued. Officers felt liberated, citizens felt protected, and the media celebrated an unprecedented example of accountability. Social media amplified every lesson, every reflection, every success. Discussions about integrity, ethics, and civic responsibility became mainstream, and the story's viral reach inspired countless conversations worldwide. One of the most powerful moments came during a reflective hearing months later. Officers and citizens shared their thoughts on the transformation. They spoke of courage, of the importance of accountability, and of the need to maintain integrity even in small, everyday decisions. It was clear that the story of one corrupt chief had created ripples far beyond the courtroom. It had ignited a movement for ethical action and civic responsibility. Through it all, the core message was undeniable. Justice is not just a concept, it is action. Accountability is not optional, it is a duty. Integrity is not negotiable, it is essential. And courage, whether from a judge, a young officer, or a citizen, can change the course of history. Mancuso's arrest was not merely a headline. It was a turning point, a demonstration of what happens when truth confronts power without fear or compromise. For the international audience following the story, it was a vivid lesson. People learned that systemic corruption can be challenged, that ethical behavior can prevail, and that accountability is achievable even in the face of decades of abuse. Millions of viewers were inspired to reflect on their own communities, workplaces, and governments, asking whether they too could act with integrity and courage. And now, as the story comes to its conclusion, the final reflection is clear. Accountability transforms communities, courage empowers individuals, and integrity restores trust. The courtroom that once made my blood run cold became a symbol of hope, a reminder that justice is not just about punishment. It is about restoring balance, confidence, and fairness. So here's the message I want every viewer to take away. In your life, in your work, in your community, never underestimate the power of speaking the truth. Stand up for what is right, even when it's hard. Support accountability, demand integrity, and don't let fear dictate your actions. If we all act with courage, honesty, and responsibility, no corrupt system, no arrogant leader, and no abuse of power can stand for long. If this story inspired you, share it. Talk about it with your family, your friends, and your colleagues. Educate others about integrity, accountability, and the importance of standing up to wrongdoing. Follow local events, support honest leaders, and encourage transparency in your community. Every small act of courage matters. Together, we can create a world where justice prevails, where integrity is respected, and where accountability becomes the standard, not the exception. Remember, the power of one voice, one brave action, one decision to act honestly can change everything. Let this story be your reminder, your guide, and your inspiration to act with integrity every day.